And here we are for the last Bible study before our 2 week break for the holidays. So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear God in heaven, we are so glad to celebrate your incarnation one more time and to give us a little break too from studying, just to celebrate your birth, and then on January 1st to celebrate your mother as your mother, as the Holy Mother of God. Bless us tonight in our Bible study. Open our hearts to your word. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, sharing the screen and hitting the road here. All right, here we go. We are now on 1 Samuel chapters 9 through 24. So we are getting there to the end. And we always have to start out with our review, right? We don't want to forget the Old Testament, the whole story. So, creation, fall, flood, nations, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, redemption, revelation, sacrifice, sanctification, tribes, tragedy, transition, coverage, commands, covenants, conquest, settlement, cycles, love. And we got to Samuel, right? We started out with creation with our original covenant between Adam and Eve. They fall into original sin. Noah is the only family that's saved in the flood, so the covenant's redone with one holy family. Everybody goes bonkers again. We've got the Tower of Babel. We have Abraham finally being called back by God. We have Isaac, his son, who's a very close type of Christ. He was asked to sacrifice him, but stopped at that last minute. Jacob, who's Israel, who has the 12 sons. Joseph, his 11th son, who goes to Egypt, redeems them from the famine, reveals himself as their brother. His father Israel sacrifices, and then the whole family's set apart in Egypt. The tribes flourish, but then the pharaohs forget them. They transition into slavery for 400 years, which is coverage. Coverage ends with Moses floating in the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter picks him up. He kills an Egyptian and runs away. He's commanded to go back by Yahweh. And then he gets them out of Egypt through the Red Sea. He gets the 10 Commandments. A new covenant is made with now one holy nation. They finally win over the chosen land. They settle into it and they start their cycles. And when they're faithful to Yahweh, they're on top of the world, but then they fall away from him when they get rich and wealthy. They fall away from God. Does it remind you of today by any chance? They fall away from God, and when they get to the bottom and cry out to God because they're so miserable, he raises up a judge. They start worshiping as they're supposed to again. They get wealthy and powerful. They fall away from God. He raises up a judge. And we heard about 6 major judges and 6 minor judges. And those were the cycles. And then right after that, we did our reading of the book of Ruth, that little bit of love in between. Ruth the Moabite, who ends up marrying Boaz, a Bethlehemite. They have a son named Jesse. And we learned all about that in today's readings, right? Because Jesse is the father of David. And then last week we heard about Samuel. Samuel is the last judge of Israel, kind of a miraculous birth from a barren mother who promises to give him to the Lord if she can have a child. And she does. He goes to study under Eli, the priest. He himself becomes a priest and then a great judge of Israel and the last judge. Because at the very end of our readings last time, Israel is crying out for a king. They want a king like all the other nations. And Yahweh tells Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they are rejecting me. And go warn them about what it's going to mean to have a king. And Samuel does that, and he tells them it's going to stink, but they don't care. They want a king. They want to be like all the other nations. And so that's where we left off, was Yahweh telling Samuel that he would give them a king. So it's not going to make a lot of sense, these readings today, especially if we don't remember that the books of Samuel were written many years after Samuel himself was the final judge of Israel. And there are two different traditions that are gathered together and written down. One of those traditions, we call, or scholars call, the Ramah tradition. Ramah being the place that Samuel was from. And it was kind of those people in Israel who, like Samuel, didn't think that it was the best idea to want a king. And the other tradition is called the Gilgal tradition. And the Gilgal tradition are the people who did want a king, that they wanted somebody to lead them into battle and to be this warrior king. So the people who write Samuel, who put it down into writing, combine these two traditions. And so it won't make sense. Otherwise, you're like, what? I thought he was already anointed. Huh? He's being anointed again. What? So that's how you make sense of it, is knowing that two traditions are being reflected by the writers. So the first one in chapter 9, this is coming from the Ramah tradition, from those who really didn't want a king, but if you're going to have one, it should be somebody who Yahweh personally picks. And there's a lot of miraculous type stuff that goes along on it. So we've got Saul, this handsome young Benjamite, and he goes looking for his dad's donkeys. His dad's lost 3 donkeys, so Saul takes a servant and they wander off to look for these donkeys, but they can't find them. So his servant says, oh, why don't we go to Zuph, where they've got a seer or a prophet, and we'll get some help from the seer. And you can see again that this has been written by somebody in the future, because they put in parentheses, seer is what they used to call what we now call a prophet. And so a little explanation from those writing in the future to help people understand the book of Samuel. So they see Samuel, Saul does, and Samuel has already been told by Yahweh that I'm going to send you the king of Israel, and I will tell you who it is. And so the Lord identifies Saul as the one who's to be anointed. And it's interesting that when you anoint somebody, they become the Christ. And so Saul is the first Christ of the Bible. He's the first anointed one of the Bible. And of course, we always think of Jesus Christ, but Saul was also anointed, so he would have also been a Christ. So Saul is not quite so sure, right? Samuel is going up on the high places to sacrifice to God. And this was something that was allowed early on in the Israeli tradition. What they were doing, they conquered lands that were Canaanite lands, and the Canaanites always built their altars up on the high places. So when Israel took them, they would make their own altar up on the high places, and they would sacrifice to Yahweh there. And that was where Samuel was headed when he met Saul. And he says to Saul, hey, come on up to the high place. I'm going to make sacrifices to our God, and you come on up. And Saul is, when he finds out that he's supposed to be anointed, he's not so sure about it. He kind of uses Gideon's line. He says, yeah, I'm from the smallest tribe. I'm from the least family in it. Are you sure you really want me to be king? And and Saul's like, come on up. And he sits him at a special seat of honor at the feast, because they always had big feasts with the sacrifices. And afterwards he says, all right, it's time now to go back down from the high spot. But here, you sleep on the roof, and in the morning we'll take care of business. And so he gets him up first thing in the morning and anoints him as the king. So Samuel pours oil on Saul's head and kisses him, and then tells him three signs that God's going to give him to reassure him that he's really meant to be the king. Now, when Saul said he was from the smallest tribe in Israel, he didn't really mean population wise, but you can see that Benjamin's land is pretty small, but it does include Jerusalem and Jericho, the first place they took. Remember when Joshua came across the Jordan, the first place they conquered was Jericho. And here's Gibeon, or Gibeah as it's called, and that was Saul's home, was Gibeah. And we heard about it last week, not in the greatest terms ever. And we're going to hear about Mitzvah. And Mitzvah is near Jerusalem, and it was where people were oftentimes called together. All the different tribes that are out here, they would be called together. You can see it's kind of a central spot here in the chosen land. So Samuel pours oil on Saul's head. It's interesting enough that in the Catholic Church, when a priest becomes a priest, he's also anointed with oil on his head. The bishop gives him a kiss, uh, and in this case, the three signs that are going to be given to Saul, right? They can seem kind of strange to us when we read them, but they're signs just to reassure him that he's really meant to be the king. He's going to meet two people over by Rachel's tomb, and they're going to tell him, your father's not worried about those donkeys anymore. They've been found, but he's worried about you. And then you're going to meet three people, and three people are going to, they're going to be carrying a kid goat, and they're going to be carrying bread, and they're going to be carrying a flask of wine, and they're going to give you two of these loaves of bread. Take them. And then the third sign is that when you get to Gibeah, you're going to meet a band of prophets. And the Canaanites prophets used to do the same thing. They would go around. It was really like kind of a rock band thing. These were, we think of them as lower prophets. They're not like the prophets that we're going to read about. Well, we're not covering the prophets, but not like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the major prophets of Yahweh. These are really minor prophets, and they are kind of almost like Pentecostals. They go around, they usually got tambourines and flutes, they're playing music, and they go into ecstasies. And they draw other people into ecstasy with them. And sure enough, all three of these signs pass. And on the third one, Saul joins this band of prophets, and he starts prophesying too. So he realizes that this really is Yahweh's plan. So Samuel calls all the tribes together at Mitzvah, which is down here by Jerusalem, and he shows by lot that Saul is meant to be king. And the way he does that, he's got representatives from all 12 tribes. Remember the Urim and the Thummim? That's what he uses. And at first, they has all the tribes walk by him, and it's the tribe of Benjamin that's picked out. And then he has all the families of Benjamin come before him, and it's uh, Saul's family that's picked out. And then Saul is picked out, even though he's not there. And everybody's like, well, where is Saul? Well, he what he really wants to be the first king of Israel, right? It's a scary thing. He's hiding in the baggage. So they go and they find him, they bring him back, and he's head and shoulders above the other Israelites. He's very handsome, he's very tall, and there is no one else in Israel like him. So it becomes clear that Saul is to be king, and Samuel writes down all the duties of a king and also all the responsibilities of the people towards the king. And then he lays it before the Lord to show that this is Yahweh's law for this new king. And everybody goes home. But there are a few naysayers there. And these worthless men were not convinced that Saul could save them, that he should be the king. And we hear about them a little bit in the next chapters. In chapter 11, we hear about the defeat of the Ammonites, and it's another story about the anointing of Saul, right? We have the people who really never really wanted a king, but miraculously Saul is chosen as a king for them because Yahweh has condescended to it. Then we have the people that really wanted the king, and they want a great general, somebody who's going to lead them into battle. Well, now we get the story of Saul's anointing from that tradition. And it starts out with Nahash the Ammonite, who besieges Jabesh Gilead. And so he is across the Jordan River, on the east side of the Jordan River, over where Manasseh has settled. And Nahash is very powerful. And so the Israelites are afraid of him. And they're like, make a covenant with us. And he says, okay, I'll make a covenant, but only if you'll all gouge out your right eyes. And then you'll be like the shame of Israel. And then I'll make a covenant with you and I won't kill you. And they're like, give us 7 days to think about this, So it's a lot to gouge out our right eyes. So they send messengers out to the rest of Israel to see if there's anybody who will come to save them. And the messengers make it to Gibeah, and Saul's out in the field plowing, but the messengers tell the rest of the city, and they all start weeping for their cousins and nephews and nieces that are over there in Nahash's territory. And Saul hears about it when he comes in from the field, and he decides to raise up an army. And so what does he do? It kind of reminds you of last week's story of the concubine who died on the doorstep, and they cut her up into pieces and sent it out to Israel. Well, this time it's not quite so gory, because Saul just takes a couple of oxen, he cuts them up into pieces, he sends their pieces out, and he says to the rest of his tribes, hey, listen, you need to come and join this army, and if you don't, I'm going to cut your oxen up like this. So he does raise up an army, and they go and they free Jabesh Gilead. And then they all go to Gilgal to make Saul king. So here is going to be a second anointing of Saul. And this is a great depiction from the Morgan Bible. The old Bibles were so awesome with their pictures. They look like Knights of the Crusade, but this is Saul slaying Nahash, who's over in here. And then he's being anointed by Samuel down in this picture. And then here he is sacrificing a lamb to the Lord. And so now, from both traditions, we've got Saul as king, and Samuel knows that his job is done. So he does something that's been done before. He reviews their history, right? That's what Moses did right before Moses died, right on the outskirts of the chosen land. He goes through their entire history. He reminds them how the Lord brought them out of Egypt, but that they forgot him after they got into the chosen land. And then he gave them over to their enemies, but he raised up judges. And Samuel names enemies. He names judges like Jephthah. The last judge that he names is himself, right? He was raised up. And, but he says, you know, you cried for a king and the Lord decided to give you one. Now you got Saul. My job's finished. But I'm going to tell you, you people need to follow the Lord. And Saul, your new king, he needs to follow the Lord. Because if you don't, you're going to be in trouble. And then Samuel, just to make his point, asked the Lord to put the fear of God in them. And the way that that happens is they're in a very, very dry part of Israel, where wheat is the major crop. You can think of Kansas or Montana or Oklahoma, those very dry places where wheat is able to be grown and harvested. And the harvest is an especially dry time. And Samuel says, you know, this is the harvest day. You were going to start your harvest. Well, watch this. And he has Yahweh bring in thunder and rain, and it does put the fear of God into the people. But then, after he does that, Samuel reassures them. He says, you know, I know God has just done something very mighty for you. However, I want you to know that you need to stick close to him, that he is your God, you are his people. He has a covenant with you and he's chosen you especially. And I will continue to keep you in my prayers, even though you chose not to have a judge anymore. You know, you're still in my prayers. And Samuel has a soft spot in his heart for the Israeli people and for Saul in particular, the king that he anointed. However, Saul ticks Samuel off and Yahweh in the next chapter in 13. Saul's son Jonathan goes out and defeats the Philistines at a battle at Geba. And when he does that, the Philistines suddenly take notice of the Israelites, whom they have obviously been lording over, because it tells us in chapter 13 that the Israelites didn't have any real weapons, that the Philistines had made sure that their blacksmiths could not make swords or shields or anything, spears that were needed for warfare. They only made farming instruments. And Israel used to go and get their farming instruments changed in, you know, their plows and their axes and their scythes. They'd go and get them sharpened up and reformed so that they could use them as some type of weapon. But the Philistines really made sure that they didn't have weapons. And so when Saul's son Jonathan, who happens to have a weapon, uh, takes men out and beats some of the Philistines, the rest of Israel becomes very afraid. And Saul tries from Gilgal to raise up an army. And but the Israelites are, I mean, they come to him because they have to, but they're trembling, they're scared. And before they go into battle, Saul says, Samuel, we need to make some burnt offerings to Yahweh because we really need him to win this battle. So I'll give you 7 days to get here. And then on the seventh day, you go ahead, you do the burnt offerings, and then we'll go into battle. So he's got all these terrified men that are with him. And Samuel's late in coming. So Saul decides that he is going to make the sacrifice himself. So he does. And of course, as soon as he's through with this burnt offering, here comes Samuel. And Samuel's like, you just crossed one of those lines in the sand with Yahweh. You are not a priest of Aaron, and you are not allowed to make sacrifices. And you have torqued off Yahweh, and you have torqued me off, and I am not going to follow you anymore. And Samuel's soldiers already have decided that they're going to go hide in our Saul's soldiers have decided they're going to hide in rocks and crevices, and they're don't have a lot of faith anyway. And and Saul, he grabs the robe of Samuel and he actually tears a piece of it off. He's pulling at him so hard, and he's like, Samuel, don't leave me in front of my people like this, because they're already afraid, and if you go, things will be a mess. And so Samuel turns and goes with him, but he says, you tearing off a piece of my robe indicates the way that Yahweh is going to tear the kingship of Israel away from you. And Samuel tells Saul that the Lord's going to replace him with a man after Yahweh's own heart. And of course, that man is going to be David. And so as war approaches, only Saul and Jonathan have swords and spears. And here they just have wine cups. But I thought it was kind of a neat little illustration of the Philistines going to war with the Israelites who were without weapon. So battling the Philistines, everybody else is afraid, but Jonathan, Saul's son, is not afraid. Jonathan has a servant, and he's sneaking across Philistine lines, right? The Philistines have broken into 3 groups. And basically what they're going to do is send these 3 different groups of soldiers out across Israel to raid, to take all their wealth, to take all their animals, to steal the women that they want. Well, Jonathan sneaks over the enemy lines, and he sees up on this watch point, up on this watchtower, a group of Philistines. And he trusts in the Lord, right? And he tells his servant, Yahweh is with us. Let's go ahead and attack these Philistines. And we'll see, if Yahweh's really with us, when they see us, they'll say, come up to us, instead of coming down to us. And sure enough, the Philistines see them, and they're like, oh, look, the Israelites are coming out of their little hiding spots. Isn't that sweet? Hey, come on up here, you guys. Come on up here. And so Jonathan and his servant do. And when they crawl up there, they kill them, which the Philistines never expected. And now their watch point people have been killed, and the rest of the Philistine camp finds out about it, and they go into chaos. And then the earth starts trembling. And Saul, meanwhile, Jonathan and his servant never told them that they were going to leave camp. But Saul hears and sees that the Philistines are panicking. And so he does a roll call and figures out Jonathan's not there, and must have surmised that Jonathan had somehow caused this chaos. And so Saul rallies around the Ark of the Covenant, and the Lord delivers, right? And I thought this was really cool. It's a replica of the Ark of the Covenant in the George Washington Masonic National Memorial. Now, the Masons are not friends of the Catholic Church. I think a lot of Masons have forgotten that, but it was a group that was really formed to try to destroy the Catholic Church. But they sure made a neat replica of the Ark of the Covenant. And so back in Saul's time, of course, the ark would go in, oftentimes go into battle with them. So Saul rallies about it, and they beat the Philistines in this first battle. But of course, they're going to have to go for more battles. And Saul says to all the people, "We're going to fast before we go into this battle." And that's not an unusual thing. I mean, fasting still remains a very powerful thing that we do to show our discipline to God, that we're disciplined and we're willing to give up things for Him, because He gave up His life for us, right? Jesus did. And so on Good Friday, we fast. And we have another fast day on, I'm trying to think, Lent, Ash Wednesday, when we start thinking about the 40 days in the desert that Christ went without food. We fast then. Well, so Saul has told all of the people to fast before they go into this big battle. Um, but Jonathan's not with him, right? He's already been out fighting the Philistines. He doesn't know about this fast. So as he's coming in through the land, he views this honeycomb, and he puts the tip of his spear in it, and he eats some honey. And the people see him do it, and his eyes get bright, right? When you're really hungry and you finally eat some food, you get some energy back. And they're like, "Did you know that your dad put a curse on anybody who didn't keep a fast until the evening time?" And Jonathan's like, "Well, that's stupid. Look how bright my eyes are. Like, you need food if you're going to fight." And, but they're like, "Oh, this is not good." But they like Jonathan. And they themselves do something that's not kosher with Yahweh either. The evening comes, the fast is over, but now they take all this livestock that they have stolen from the Philistines. Not stolen, but right, they won the battle, so they took their lambs and their oxen, and they're so hungry that they start eating them with the blood still in them. And that's a no-no, right? The blood, that's the life-giving force, that belongs to Yahweh. So Saul finds out about it, and he calls all the people to him. And he says, "Hey, you know, bring your livestock with you. You can eat it here on this rock, on this altar, but we'll do it the right way. We'll bleed them out, then you can eat them." And so that's what the people do. But Saul is now curious about, he's asking the Lord, "Am I going to win these next battles against the Philistines?" And he's not getting an answer. So he wants to know, who's at fault for this? Why is he not getting an answer from God? And so he says to God, using again the Urim and the Thummim, "Is it the people, or is it me and Jonathan that have crossed you?" And it's him and Jonathan. And so then he says, "Well, is it me or is it Jonathan?" And it's Jonathan. And so then he says, "I'll kill Jonathan. I'll kill my son." And Jonathan says, "I'll die." Kind of reminds you of Jephthah's daughter, right? "Okay, if that's what it takes, I'm ready to die." But the people now rise up and they say, "Hey, hey, hey, Jonathan, he's already been fighting. He's already defeated a bunch of the Philistines. He's a good guy. He needs to be kept alive." And his father listens, and Jonathan's life is ransomed by the people. And then we're told that Saul, it's kind of a summary of Saul's whole kingship, all the different people that he has to fight on every side. So in chapter 15, we see another disobedience of Saul. This one is kind of the icing on the cake. The Lord orders Saul to strike the Amalekites and destroy everything. That's called a ban against the city. And so Saul has been ordered to do this ban against the Amalekites. But the first thing he does is he goes and he separates out the Kenites, which may have been okay. They weren't really Amalekites, right? The Kenites were the descendants of Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. And so they had always been friends of Israel and they'd always helped Israel. And so Saul tells them, separate yourself from the Amalekites. And then he goes to war with the Amalekites, but he spares Agag, their king, and the best of the sheep and the oxen, right? Which is exactly what God said not to do. He said not to spare any living thing. But when Samuel brings this up to Saul, like, what the heck are you doing? You were supposed to kill everything. And he said, well, we kept the best sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord. Well, but not two paragraphs later, he says it's because he feared the people. The people wanted to sacrifice to the Lord, but I wanted to kill everything, but they didn't want to, and I feared for my life. And so, but see, this is a lesson about martyrdom that, and it's true. After Christ, we always say that the church was built up by the blood of the martyrs. If if you are asked to deny God or lose your life, you lose your life, right? And um, here he feared for himself, right? And plus he just wanted to make the people happy. He wanted to be a popular king. So the Lord ends up saying that he was sorry that he had made Saul king over Israel. And Samuel is furious, and he tells Saul to go get the king of the Amalekites, to get a god for him, and Samuel butchers him. And these are powerful words. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Right? Those things that Saul had chosen were tremendously offensive to God. And it made the Lord sorry that he had made Saul king over Israel. So in chapter 16, we get the first story of David's anointing. And this is a beautiful thing that comes from the 200s AD, the 3rd century AD, a picture of Samuel anointing David. And Samuel's told to go to Jesse in Bethlehem. And, Samuel's like, he knows he's supposed to anoint somebody to be the new king, not Saul. And he's afraid, he says, well, what is Saul going to do if he knows that I'm going to anoint somebody else? And so Yahweh says to him, take a heifer with you, right? And just tell him you're going there to do a sacrifice, and invite Jesse and his family to the sacrifice. And so that's what Samuel does. He invites Jesse, and he sees Jesse. Jesse has 7 sons with him, and he sees his oldest son, and he's like, there's the one. Nope, Yahweh says, not that one. He goes through all 7 sons. Nope, not that one. So Samuel asked Jesse, do you have another son? And he's like, oh, I do. It's my youngest son, but he's out tending the sheep. Call him in. So he calls him in, and sure enough, Yahweh says, this is the one. This little baby here who was guarding the sheep, he is going to be the new king of Israel. So at the sacrificial feast, Yahweh tells Samuel to anoint David. and hence the picture of David being anointed over here. And we're told that when David is anointed, the Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord torments him. Now, in the faith that's been opened up by the church, we know that God doesn't do things like send evil spirits on us. He'll allow them to be sent, but he doesn't do evil himself. He only allows it if he can bring greater good from it. But back in the days of the Old Testament, everything was attributed to Yahweh. Yahweh was the source of everything. So if an evil spirit came upon Saul, that evil spirit came from God. But the truth of the matter is that Yahweh allowed an evil spirit now to attack Saul, and it torments him. And meanwhile, the Spirit of God has come into David. And well, so Saul is being tormented, and his servants see this, and they say, you know, music soothes the savage beast, is basically what they say to him. And they say, lyre, if somebody could play the lyre for you, that would really help you with this foul temper that you have gotten with this evil spirit that is coming about with you. And so they say, we actually know somebody who can play the lyre and the harp. And so let's call this son of Jesse, and his name's David. He's a shepherd. And so they do. David becomes Saul's lyre player and his armor bearer because Saul loves him so much. And so there's the first story of David being anointed the king of Israel. But in chapter 17, right, that was the account by the Rama tradition. But now we got the Gilgal tradition, the tradition that loves having a king because they lead you into battle. And so in this account, David, the shepherd boy, kills Goliath, right? Here's Saul, who's gone out to fight with the Philistines. There's a great big huge army over here, great big huge army over here. But the Philistines have a single warrior who is enormous, Goliath. And nobody really likes war. So the Philistines are like, hey, instead of having this giant war, why don't we instead just have our one fierce warrior come out, and you guys pick somebody to fight him, and whoever wins in this battle of one-on-one wins the war, and then you'll be our servant, right? Because Goliath's going to win. And all the tribes of Israel, all the men are terrified because Goliath is enormous, and he's got all this armor and his very big huge sword, and so they don't want to do it. Meanwhile, Jesse has sent David to his brothers on the front line. Right, David's too young to fight, but his father wants to make sure that his brothers are well fed. And so he sends David with some stuff for the brothers. And David sees this whole thing happening, and he's like, I trust in the Lord. I'll take on Goliath, which he does with his slingshot and 3 stones. And we all know the story of him taking his rock and hitting Goliath in the head, and Goliath falls down, and David takes his sword and chops his head off. And there's the picture of him holding up Goliath's head. And we're told that he takes his head and the sword to Jerusalem. But obviously, this is a later editor putting that in because Jerusalem hasn't been conquered yet. David is the one who conquers Jerusalem. And so it would seem unlikely place to take his head. But if the temple had been there, then I guess you would have done that. But this is the second story of how Saul is introduced to David. Because now Saul says, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And so here's the second story of how the two are introduced to each other. So Saul's jealousy is enormous because now you've got this young man. Saul is now a grown man. And um, even Jonathan, Saul's son, is much older than David. But when Jonathan sees David and David sees Jonathan, they just are kindred spirits and their souls are knit together, we're told. They really and truly become blood brothers. They are just like very close to each other. But Saul, right, he liked this lyre player and he really liked his armor bearer and he really liked this kid who killed Goliath, but he hates the songs that all the women are coming up with, you know. Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. It's like a little jibe at Saul that he can only kill thousands. Yeah, he's an okay leader, but that David, man, he is the cat's meow. And so Saul tries to spear him. In fact, he tries to spear him twice, and twice David evades the spearing. And so then Saul decides to cook up a plan to defeat David using his daughters Merab and Michal. And um, first of all, he thinks, well, I'll marry my oldest daughter, Merab, off to David. And we don't really hear exactly what his plan is going to be. But in the meantime, somebody else comes and he marries off his first daughter, his oldest daughter, to them. And the whole time, David is thinking to himself, I'm just like this lowly shepherd boy. I'm going to marry into the royal family? Holy schmoly. Well, Merab gets married, but Michal says, hey, I love David. Let me marry him. And Saul thinks to himself, awesome. That is awesome because I'm going to have my messengers go back and tell David that he is to marry her. But the present I want for his getting my daughter is 100 foreskins from the Philistines, right? Foreskins because Philistines are not of the chosen people, so they're not circumcised. So that's how you can be sure that they're coming from Philistines, is if you're getting foreskins. And he is sure that if David goes off to do this on his own, that he's going to get killed by the Philistines. They're mighty warriors. But of course, David goes off. Not only does he come back with 100 foreskins, he comes back with 200 foreskins. So Michal becomes his wife. And in chapter 19, we're told that jealousy overcomes reason. I love this picture over here. This is Saul, the jealous king, and you can see he's going mad. He's actually going insane over his jealousy of this handsome young lyre player who's just like the world's greatest soldier. And so Saul is cooking up plans again to kill David, but Jonathan reasons with him, right? He's like, Dad, David is such a nice guy and he's a great soldier and he's so loyal to you. You don't want to kill him. And Saul's, he's, he's almost bipolar. He's like, yeah, you're right. I do love him. Yeah, bring him back in. And but then David goes out because Saul sends him out to fight Philistines, and the Spirit of God is with David, and he has this great success. And so once again, we see down here Saul's spear, and he tries to spear his harp player again. And he's unsuccessful because David's young and lithe, and he jumps out of the way, and he goes to his wife, Michal, and they're at their house, and Saul sends messengers to surround it because they're going to kill him. And Michal comes up with a plan. Um, she helps David escape through the window, which is very reminiscent of what Rahab the harlot did back in Jericho. Remember when the spies came from Israel and they went into Rahab's house of ill repute, and Rahab helps them escape through a window and then ties a red scarf up there. Well, Michal helps David escape through a window also, and to make it look like he's still there, so if the messengers are like spying in the windows and stuff, it's kind of interesting because it says she saved him with a teraphim. Remember, a teraphim from last week is a household god, right? And this household god is big, right? Because she's going to put it under the covers, cover it up with the covers, put some goat hair on the top of it so it looks like David. And uh, so still you get this idea that Israel has come a long way, but they haven't come all the way yet. They still have household gods in their home. They're still not what Yahweh needs them to be. So David has gone out the window and he escapes and goes to Naoth in Ramah. And he ends up joining one of these roving bands of prophets. And Samuel, of course, is in Ramah. And Saul sends messengers to kill David because he hears he's there. And the messengers start prophesying. And finally, Saul goes himself. But he himself starts prophesying, right? He's unable to kill David. So we have a band of prophets made up of the greatest men of Israel. In chapters 20 and 21, David ends up fleeing again, right? After this prophesying, Saul obviously has been kind of placated again. His bipolar part has gone back to loving David, or at least accepting him. But every new moon, there's a 3-day feast. And David is supposed to be there. He's the harp player and he's the armor bearer for Saul. But he and Jonathan have met beforehand. And David's afraid of Saul. And Jonathan says, let me see what my dad's plans are. Because, of course, he would tell me. I'm his oldest son. He would tell me if he was going to kill you. And so you go ahead and go hide in this field by this rock. And after I find out what dad's intentions are, I'll come out with some arrows. And if he really does plan to kill you, I'll shoot him past the rock, and then I'll tell my own armor bearer to go beyond the rock. That'll be my sign to you. So Jonathan's there at the feast with his father, and but of course David is not there. And the first night Saul doesn't really say anything. On the second night, he's like, boy, David must be unclean. He must have had sex with his wife, right? That makes a man unclean. And Jonathan's like, well, Dad, really, David asked me if he could go down to Bethlehem to be with his family because they have a big feast down there, and he wanted to be with them. So I excused him for 3 days. And Saul just hits the roof, and he actually throws a spear at his own son, Jonathan. And Jonathan, it becomes clear to him that, yeah, Dad really does want to kill David. So he goes out and shoots his arrows past the rock and tells his servant to go beyond the rock. So David knew, but then he actually meets with Jonathan, and Jonathan tells him, you need to hit the road here, buddy, because Dad really does want to kill you. And so David stops at Nob. And Nob, remember, Shiloh was the place where the Ark of the Covenant was, and all the priests were at Shiloh. But in last week's readings, uh, Shiloh didn't fare well because the Philistines won the battle and they actually took the Ark of the Covenant, and they eventually send the Ark back because all of the bad things that happened to them. But the priests flee from Shiloh and they go to Nob. And so that's where the tent of meeting is now. And that's where the altar of presence is. And the altar of presence is where they put a week's worth of bread. And then on the seventh day, they change the bread out for new warm bread. And the priests get to eat the showbread. Well, David stops and he says, I need bread. Hey, give me your bread. He is alone, but from the reading, it sounds like he's got men someplace else. And the priest says to him, the only bread I have is the showbread, the bread of the presence. And that's for priests only. And David says, give it to me. And they do. And remember, we talked about this before, because this is this little incident right here where David gets the showbread is mentioned by Christ when the Pharisees asked him, why are your disciples eating on the Sabbath? And he says, David stopped, he doesn't say at Nob, but he says he ate the showbread and he wasn't a priest, so it's okay if my guys eat on the Sabbath day. Well, so he eats the showbread and he gets Goliath's sword, which happens to be here also. And they tell him, it is the sword that you won from Goliath. And then he flees to Gath. And Gath is again Canaanite. And there the king, he recognizes David, right? He's like, this is the guy, he's been anointed by Yahweh. He's the king of Israel. And David's afraid because he's in enemy territory here. And if they really think he's king, then they're going to kill him. So what he does is he pretends to be mad. He like slobbers all over his beard and he's like squiggling stuff on the gates of the city. And the king of Gath looks out at him and he's like, the guy's nuts. I don't even care that he's here. But David decides to leave because that's too close for too close a call. So in chapters 22 through 24, we get the game of cat and mouse, right? The cat is Saul, the mouse is David. And so he runs from Gath and moves to the cave of Adullam. And at Adullam, his brothers from his family come to be with him, along with all the other people who Saul is torquing off, because he's not really a very good king. So we're told that 400 men join him at this cave. And then he can't stay in one place very long, so he moves to Moab. And his parents have also come to the cave, so he takes them to Moab. Now remember that David has relatives in Moab because Ruth was a Moabite. And so he drops his mom and dad off in Moab and says, take care of them until I return. And then he heads off with the rest of his soldiers for the forest of Hereth in Judah. And then he moves from there to liberate Keilah because he's heard that Keilah is being attacked. And so he goes to rescue them. Now, meanwhile, when he was in Nob, there was a guy who saw him, Doeg the Edomite, and he was there getting the showbread, right? And he saw Doeg, and so Saul now finds out that David was in Nob, and he wants all the priests of Nob killed. And so he tells his own people, go kill all the priests. And they're like, these guys are priests of Yahweh. Oh, we are Yahweh's people. We're not doing it. So they just refuse. But Doeg, he's an Edomite. He doesn't care. So he does. He kills them for Saul. But one priest escapes, Abiathar, and he escapes to warn David at Keilah. And and you would think that all the people of Keilah would be on um, David's side, right? Because he liberated them. But they're not really. They're wanting to send out spies back to Saul to tell him where David's at because Saul is still the king of Israel. So the Keilah is a part of Ziph, and we're told that the Ziphites are the ones who want to tell Saul where David is. So David flees from Keilah and he goes into the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. And Jonathan comes to meet him. And here's a beautiful painting of Jonathan with David. And Jonathan reassures him, you are meant to be the king of Israel. And I will be your second. You know, Jonathan didn't care. He knew that this was Yahweh's choice. And so he comes to reassure him. And Jonathan leaves then, and David flees off into the wilderness of Maon. And the Ziphites seek to betray David. So they go and they tell Saul, and Saul comes out chasing David. And they're basically on two sides of a gorge, and there's a great big huge rock in between them. And here's Saul with this big huge army, and David with his 400 men, and David is losing ground. Saul's coming around the gorge and he's going to get him. But then messengers come and they tell Saul, sorry, you got to come back because the Philistines are doing raids on the country. So Saul backs away, even though he was about to catch David, and he heads back to deal with the Philistines. And David flees from the rock of escape. I love the names of the rocks, right? He flees from the rock of escape to En Gedi. Now, this is just like a beautiful picture. I just looked up En Gedi. I love to look on Wiki to see what they have. And there's actually an oasis there, which is why David would have headed there. It's all desert land, but it's got all these limestone caves, and then it's got this oasis, and they've actually named this David Falls in En Gedi. So Saul seeks David in front of Wild Goats Rock, we're told. And so he's going to go and find David again. He's done with the Philistines who were raiding. He's back on David's trail. But on the way, he has to relieve himself. So he goes into a cave, and it just happens to be the cave. In the very back of the cave, that's where David and all of his men are hiding. So Saul's like reading the newspaper and going to the bathroom, and David sneaks up behind him and cuts off the skirt of his robe instead of killing him, because he could have killed him easily enough, right? The guy's squatting down, going to the bathroom. And so he doesn't. He cuts off this robe, but as soon as he does it, he's sorry he's done it, because back in those days, it's almost like the Indians used to count coup instead of killing people. They just like go by them and they touch them, and it was called counting coup. And so they didn't really kill them, but they could have killed them, so it counts as a kill. Well, that's how cutting off this piece of robe was. It counted as a kill, and David was ashamed that he'd done it because this was God's anointed one. And so when Saul leaves the cave, David goes after him, and he says to him, I am not going to kill you. That it's you and I, our futures are held by Yahweh, and Yahweh will determine them. And he says, may the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me upon you, but my hand shall not be against you. Right? If God decides to take action against you, that's one thing. But me, I I am not going to. And here's the bottom of your robe, just for proof. I could have killed you, but I didn't. And Saul is like, David, David, my son, right? Are you? The bipolar part of him swings again, and they make a covenant. David swears to Saul that he will not cut off Saul's descendants, nor destroy his name out of his father's house. And you will learn in next week's reading that David is good to his word. He does not take action against Saul or his descendants. However, Yahweh has a different plan for Saul. And so that's when we return in actually 3 weeks. We get 2 weeks off. So we'll be gone until January 6th. And then I will text these readings to you so that you have them, and along with my picks. And until then, I just want you to have a blessed and joyful Christmas and a joyous solemnity of Mary there on January 1st, the Holy Mother of God. And bring in the new year with our Blessed Mother, which of course is a solemnity, i.e., it occurs on a Friday this year, so it'll probably be celebrated on Sunday. Normally in the United States, that's what we do. But anyway, you guys have a wonderful Christmas, and I will stop sharing. And hi, Dewey. I'll stop recording too,
Hi.
so that we don't all end up